questions we're going to get asked is, will you share the recording of this webinar, and will the slide deck be ready to share? And so I will say that we are absolutely sharing the slide deck. Every link that's in the slide deck that we're going to share with you will also have as a separate link on our website. And then we are also recording the section of this webinar that is the overview of the CARES Act. The Q&A portion of this webinar is going to be off the record so that you and we can feel free to share without attribution. Our team has been working tirelessly to advocate for more funding, for flexibility and guidance to support you, as well as analyzing all the emerging policies that keep popping up. And that's really what we hope to do on today's webinar. So let me just walk through the agenda very quickly. We're going to give you an overview of the CARES Act, which was the third stimulus bill that was signed into law at the very end of March, and give you a chance to ask questions, and hopefully we'll have those answers for you. We'll talk about the OCTAE guidance, both what has already come out and what we know is still in the works to come out, as well as talk about the emerging fourth stimulus bill that should have a strong focus on workforce development and CTE. We'll have a space to share, and then we'll talk at the end about upcoming events and resources that we'll be developing to support you. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. As I said, we are recording a portion of this webinar, so just put that out there for disclosure. If you've got questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the Q&A portion, which should be on the right side of your screen. And as I said, when we get to the question and answers, we'll open it up the line so that we can hear you and you don't just have to listen to us. So with that, I just want to introduce those who are going to be presenting on today's webinar. As I said, I'm Kim Green, Executive Director, and the folks who will be doing the heavy lift on today's webinar are the folks who deal day in and day out in federal policy. Our federal policy team is Sam Gignac, who's our Senior Associate for Federal Policy, and Meredith Hill is our Policy Associate. And I just want to say up front, they have been working many long hours and putting in a lot of effort to try to deal with all of the things that have been coming at them. And so I just want to publicly say thank you for their hard work as we work to try to analyze these policies as fast as we can to get you the information that you need so that you can support your learners. So with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Meredith, who's going to kick things off. So Sarah, if you want to go ahead and start the recording now, that'd be great. Meredith.
Thanks, Kim. So I just want to start off with some background on what measures Congress has taken so far. Since the beginning of March, 3 stimulus bills have been passed in response to the coronavirus. First was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. This was passed on March 6th and allocated $8.3 billion to stop the spread of coronavirus. So funding went to things such as research, public health, and medical supplies. Next came the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. This was passed on March 18th, and it provided $3.5 billion for things such as paid sick and family leave and unemployment benefits. And then third, and most recently, was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act. And as Kim mentioned, this is what we'll be talking about for most of the time today. The CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th. This followed numerous rounds of intense negotiations between congressional leadership. It's an absolutely massive bill that was pulled together pretty quickly and largely by leadership. At $2.2 trillion, this is the most significant stimulus package that the country has seen, both in the amount of money that it provides and also in the range of relief supports that it provides. So just to put this into perspective, this stimulus is about 10% of the U.S. economy. It provides funding to states, direct payments to individuals, unemployment benefits, and resources to businesses. So the scope of this bill is really far-reaching. The CARES Act includes $30.75 billion for the Education Stabilization Fund, and this is what we'll spend most of today talking about. The Education Stabilization Fund is divided into 3 parts. 1, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. 2, the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund, and 3, the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. Those 3 parts together comprise the $30.75 billion Education Stabilization Fund, and I'll go through each part of that fund. These funds do require maintenance of effort, but that can be waived if there is precipitous decline in financial resources. The goal is to get this funding to states within 30 days, and you can see the estimated allocation for your state on pages 13 to 15 of the link at the bottom of this slide. Now I'm going to walk through each of those 3 components. The first part is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which includes $2.9 billion. So this is about 9.8% of the full Education Stabilization Fund. The purpose of this funding is to support the continuation of educational services during the pandemic. From this pool of funds, states will be allocated money based on a formula that takes population and poverty into account. Once each state receives money, the SEA will determine which LEA receives this funding. The governor will determine which higher education institutions receive funding, and those institutions must serve students within that state. The governor can also designate any institution of higher education, LEA, or, quote, education-related entity as essential for carrying out emergency education services, and this opens up funding opportunities for those entities as well. Within 30 days of when this law was signed, so that was March 27th, Secretary DeVos will issue a notice that states can submit grant applications. Applications will then be approved within 30 days of submission. This funding is authorized for ESSA, National Hawaiian Education Act, and the Alaska Native Educational Equity Support and Assistance Act, Perkins, IDEA, Adult Ed and Family Literacy, and McKinney-Vento. Estimated state allocations through the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund can be found on pages 3 to 4 of the link at the bottom of this slide. The second part of the Education Stabilization Fund is the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund. This includes $13.5 billion, about 43.9% of the full Education Stabilization Fund. Money will be distributed to the SEA through a formula, and from there, 90% will go to LEAs for activities in response to coronavirus. This might be something such as planning for school closures and purchasing technology. And again, a notice is distributed by Secretary DeVos within 30 days, and applications will then be approved within 30 days of submission. The estimated allocation per state for the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Fund can be found on pages 5 to 7 of the link at the bottom of this page. Again, this funding is authorized for ESSA, Native Hawaiian Education Act, and Alaska Native, Perkins, IDEA, Adult Ed, and Family Literacy, and McKinney-Vento. Additional uses include measures such as addressing the needs of vulnerable student populations, training and professional development, planning for long-term closures, so how to provide meals to students, how to provide technology for online learning to students, equipment such as purchasing education technology, providing mental health supports and services, planning and implementing summer learning and after-school programs, and planning and training for reopening of schools. Now I'm going to turn to Sam to talk about the third component of the Education Stabilization Fund.
Hi, Meredith, and thank you so much for that. So in addition to touching on K-12 education, the CARES Act also has a large chunk of money that is devoted towards post-secondary and higher education. In fact, the amount of money itself is slightly more than what was allocated towards K-12. So the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund includes about $13.95 billion that is geared towards higher education and post-secondary funding. 90% of that money, about $12.557 billion, is directed directly to institutions to actually use and distribute. In addition to the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, the higher education really is sort of the slightly larger component of that. Now, if you look down a little bit, the 2.5% of that total $13.9 million is directed to the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education Program. It's about $348 million, and we'll go into that in about 2 slides. 7.5% of that, about $1.046 billion, is devoted towards historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions, those that fall under Titles 3, 5A, 7A of the Higher Education Act. That funding is split evenly between institutional support and grants to students, and it's used to defray expenses that were incurred as a result of coronavirus. And that funding is specifically towards those institutions as well. So in addition to that, $12.557 billion is in direct assistance to Title IV institutions. The calculation for that is sort of a complex formula, but it's largely based on the percentage of full-time students that at the time of this coronavirus were not in a kind of full-time distance learning or online learning environment. Now, 50% of those funds total are supposed to be directed towards supporting students, whether it's emergency student financial aid in terms of disruption to campus operations that are a result of that. Funds cannot be used for contractors in terms of capital outlays associated with facilities related to athletics or religious worship or sectarian instruction. But that is basically the primary lever that is used to help support not only the institutions, but the students that attend those as well. Now, in terms of the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, as I mentioned, a program called FIPSE, the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education Program, about $348.8 million is basically used to help support smaller schools of higher education that, as part of this, would receive less than $500,000. This program is slightly different in that it actually allows the U.S. Secretary of Education to basically choose which institutions demonstrate the highest unmet need due to coronavirus. And just like the Emergency Relief Fund, 50% must be used for students as well. Now, we wanted to include just a few different options here and resources for you to take a look at. The first one is a community college estimate by AACC, which does have a institution by institution estimate of what the funds would look like by institution. There's another link, the second one, linked to ACE, which touches on what the estimates to all Title IV institutions, so not just community colleges. And lastly, the final link on there is basically a breakdown of the total state allocations geared towards funding for this that each state would receive. Now, in addition to that, the workforce funding does include a dislocated worker assistance reserve addition. So that would basically help support the dislocated worker grants, which basically help provide areas with employment and training services in areas that would have large economic events that cause job loss. It would also include natural disasters would be a part of that. So states, Indian tribal governments are eligible if 50 or more people are laid off. The determination is the significant layoffs that increase unemployment in a given community. Now, that money is basically adding on to that program because it is expected that that will be used. Now, two other provisions that are included in this that I think are particularly interesting. So there's $50 million geared towards the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences. Now that $50 million is one of the only places in the entire CARES Act that has funding specifically devoted to expanding digital network access or purchasing internet accessible devices and providing technical support services. So I know for many of you, you do have questions and many of your local communities are struggling with some of the infrastructure issues, and money from this, even though it's under IMLS, can be used for some of those activities. Now, one of the other biggest provisions of the CARES Act is a Small Business Administration Loan. So that is $350 billion that is for small businesses, but that definition can include nonprofits and also private institutions of higher education that have under 500 employees. So it wouldn't really apply to the public institutions, but some of those nonprofit and private institutions could apply for that if they have under 500 employees. Now, as far as the Small Business Administration Loan, there's talk right now in the Senate about possibly expanding that in the next week or two. The funding for that, there's a concern might run out, so the Senate is looking at possibly expanding that chunk of money. Now, I do want to just hand the mic back over to Meredith, who will go a little bit into some of the waivers.
Thanks, Sam. Another piece of the CARES Act is the National Emergency Education Waiver. Through this waiver, the SEA, Indian Tribe, or LEA can request waivers of certain statutory or regulatory provisions. The waiver request must name the federal program affected, identify the statutory or regulatory requirements that need to be waived, explain how the current pandemic prevents ability to comply with those requirements, and also detail how the SEA, Indian Tribe, or LEA will prevent any possible downsides of the waiver being approved. Most of what is authorized for waivers are under ESSA, including the definition of professional development. These waivers do require some public notice. The waiver request can be posted to the state website, and the public must have the chance to comment on the waiver request. So I'm sure you've noticed already, the SEA must be the one to apply for this waiver. So the Perkins eligible agency, if it's not the SEA in your state, then that agency cannot apply. And at Advanced CTE, we're advocating to change this, but that's how it stands currently. The implication for Perkins within this is the opportunity to submit a waiver for Section 421B of GEPA. This is what's known as the Tidings Amendment, and this provides flexibility for the period of availability of funds and allows funds to be carried over into the following fiscal year. 30 days after this law was enacted, again, that was March 27th, Secretary DeVos will provide a report to the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the Senate Help Committee, the House Committee on Education and Labor, and the Senate and House Committees on Appropriations with additional recommendations or possible waivers. And these may fall under ESSA, IDEA, the Rehabilitation Act, or Perkins. The CARES Act also provides flexibility for WIOA funds. First, up to 20% of funds can be used for administrative costs of local workforce investment activities. And second, unused governor's reserve funds that will continue to be unused can be redirected within 30 days to local workforce boards most impacted by coronavirus for rapid response activities. And we'll go back to Sam now to talk about higher education.
Thanks, Meredith. So in addition to some of those other policy provisions that Meredith just mentioned, I did want to kind of touch on more the kind of student financial aid issues. So this bill does include language that freezes federal student loan interest, collections, and payments for Title IV loans through September 30th. The president a few weeks ago did issue guidance that would basically suspend kind of the interest, but this is a legislative approach that sort of expands on that as well. So interest collections and payments through September 30th. Currently, I have heard that there may be a future legislation that would possibly expand that, but for now, September 30th is the extension. Also, this bill dealing with the Pell Grants exhaustion limit, which is a certain number of semesters that students can be eligible to use their Pell Grants. This doesn't apply for this semester. So for this semester, students that were forced to withdraw due to coronavirus, it does not count towards their lifetime exhaustion limit. Similarly, Title IV loans, both from the student and the institution that were taken out for the semester, do not have to be returned due to coronavirus pandemic. This also removes the federal matching requirement that institutions are required to contribute to match federal funds for specific programs. And it also cancels loan obligation for students that have to withdraw due to coronavirus. Now, in terms of work-study, institutions do have flexibility to transfer up to 100% of federal work-study funds to the Supplemental Education Opportunity Grants. So these grants normally are grants that help support students experiencing hardship. It can be used to fund non-tuition and non-kind of direct school-related things like food, transportation. Now, in this situation, it does allow for emergency grants to students experiencing hardship specifically because of coronavirus. So it extends kind of that description to students specifically that are affected because of that. Now, in terms of work study, students that are participating in federal work study can still be paid for up to 1 year, even if they aren't currently working. It allows a lot of flexibility either in terms of, regular weekly or biweekly payments or in terms of one lump sum. So those students that are affected still are able to receive funding and money as part of that. The bill also includes an extension of the Health Professions Opportunity Grants, which is a part of the TANF block grant. This is a program which we signed on to in legislation last year that helps provide funding for low-income individuals to obtain education and training in high-demand, well-paying healthcare jobs. In addition, the bill has other language that expands options for the healthcare workforce. It helps direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services to look at different plans for health profession training, including a specific focus on nursing programs, also programs that focus on geriatric care. This language would help to create future opportunities specifically for healthcare and nursing professions. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Kim, who's going to explain a little bit about.
Yeah, so I think we're going to pause here and give everybody a chance to see if they've got any questions about what's been presented. I know you and Meredith presented a lot of information in a short period of time here, and so encouraging everybody to submit questions through the Q&A, and I see Pradeep has one here about explaining the